Building perspective drawing, that's what we're doing in this tutorial. I've got 9 really simple tips for you, and there's absolutely no math involved. Welcome back to my channel. If you are new here, my name is Michelle. On this channel I do all things watercolour as well as mixed media, a little bit of drawing, even some motivational stuff as well. Please do consider subscribing. If you click the bell icon, you can get notified every time I have a video for you. I make at least one free video here a week on YouTube on a Thursday with extra content for Patreon subscribers. Now, when I was learning to draw and trying to figure out perspective, I used to get books from the library and read all of this stuff, and then sometimes I'd watch videos and I'd, take in all of this information about perspective, and it would all make sense whilst I was reading it. But then later on, when I was actually painting, I found it hard to retain all of that information. So what I've got for you today are 9 simple tips, so you do not have to understand the mathematics of perspective to understand this video. I'm just going to break it down into really simple perspective tips that you can use within each painting that's just going to improve things a little bit for you. And once you take on board these small steps, these small improvements that you can make when you're placing buildings in your landscape or perhaps painting a townscape, you will eventually begin to have a much greater understanding of the rules of perspective generally. I'll be pointing my camera downwards during each of the tips to show you exactly how they're done, and I'm hoping you're going to find it really simple and really helpful too. Now, my first tip is for working from photographs. I'm going to show you how to work out the eye line of the photographer. Now, why is this important? Well, quite often when I'm teaching art classes, what I see is that people start sort of perhaps drawing the top of something that wouldn't be seen from that photographer's eye line, or they draw the bottom of something, or they draw something at an angle that's incorrect. Now, you don't need to work out all the perspective for the whole photograph. That's not what we're talking about. We're just talking about finding out where the photographer's eye line was, so that you know what he was looking up at and what he was looking down at, or her. So I've got a few photographs here. Let's have a think about how you would determine where somebody's eye line is. It's quite simple. You're going to see what you can see over the top of. There's a few caveats to that though. So let's take this picture first of all. Forgive me that it's a bit shiny. It's one I went through a phase of laminating photos, taking them to art classes thinking they would get less messed up by paint splashes. Of course they do, but it's not ideal. It didn't work very well. So when I look at this picture here of these beach huts, I mean, I have an advantage actually because I took this photograph, so I know where I was standing. I was actually down on the beach and there was a huge wall in front of me, so I was much lower than these beach huts. But if I hadn't taken this photograph, how would I figure that out? Well, it's quite simple. These beach huts have a porch in front of them, don't they? And yet I can't see onto that porch at all. I can't see the floor of those porches. Now, if I were standing level, if you were standing in front of a beach hut, you'd be able to look down and see the floor, wouldn't you? So I know that I'm low down, that my eye line here is really low down. In fact, if these beach huts were floating in space, looking at the angles here, I'd actually be able to see underneath them. So I can tell here that my eye line is really low. Another way I can tell, grabs random pen for pointer, another way I can tell is that I can actually see up underneath the roof of the porches here. That's another indication that I'm really low down in this photograph. So my eye line is going to be way down here. So let's try another one. There aren't that many clues in here. Of course, I would be able to tell by the perspective of the angles and things, but we're just looking here at something simpler, which is being able to see on top of things. Now, I'm not going to count the roof because the reason I'm not counting the roof is the fact that the roof slopes. Roofs are tipped up towards us, so being able to see the roof of a building isn't a good indicator that you're above it. But let's look at some other things. Well, there are some bricks here. I can see the tops of the bricks, so that's an indication that my eye line is higher than that. Look at this wall down here. I can see lots of the top of the wall. That again means that my eye line is higher than the wall. And even this pot here, if I look at the top, the circle part, I can actually see into that pot. Not by a lot, but by a small amount. Therefore, my eye line is going to be somewhere about here. Let's look at this one here. Again, I instinctively feel that I'm looking down at this, don't I? The paths look quite wide. If I were lower down, they would be much narrower. Again, a slanted roof like this is not an indication that we're above it, but some of these roofs are square. Look at this one here. I can slightly see on top of that, and there are little things like chimneys and the tops of these, I always call them turrets, I think it's the wrong word. Battlements, is that a word? I don't know what I'm talking about, do I? Anyway, I can see the top of these things, and there are several other places as well where there are flat objects that I can see the tops of. I can just about see the tops of these chimneys here, but it's very, very close. I'm almost at the point of not being able to see them, and I can't see inside this roof here at all, which says to me that my eye line is somewhere between this, which I'm looking down at, and this, which I'm looking up at, which means the eye line is somewhere around here. Here's another similar photograph. Again, we instinctively feel, don't we, that we're up high. Look how I can see down into this street. If I were down level with all of these buildings, I wouldn't be able to see that street at all, would I? Now again, the fact that I can see slanted rooftops doesn't really indicate anything. So I'm going to look for things that would be square. Now this here, although it's not actually square because it's being cut off, if I were to continue the square, so you've got the front of the square there, if I were to take the whole of this off of this building and just end up with a square, again, I can slightly see the top of that square. And when I look at these circular windows here, I can see the base of the windowsill a little bit. I'm starting to lose it a little bit here, so I would say that the eye line of this picture is about here. And just for double checking, look at the top of these chimneys here. I can see loads of the top of them. I'm looking down at them. So it's really important. And of course you can go the same way. You can check what you're looking up at, but unless things are floating in space, that's a lot more difficult because of gravity. Everything is grounded. So a good way of judging where your eye line is to see what you're looking down at, but don't take too much notice of roofs that slant because they are tipped up towards us. You want to look for flat objects, windowsills, chimney tops, walls, flat roofed buildings, anything that's flat, that's 90 degrees to the ground. If you can see the top of it, your eye line is above it. Now my second tip almost follows on from the first tip. This is something that I see beginners do wrong time and time again, is they draw the top of things that they can't actually see. We're always fighting when we're drawing with our brains, and our brains know how things look. They know the shape of things and they try to put them in whether or not you can actually see them. Now one really common mistake is to start drawing the top of things that your eye line is below. In other words, you wouldn't actually be able to see them. And what this does to your drawing or your painting is that it skews the perspective. And so the person that's looking at the painting sees something that doesn't quite match up. They might not be able to say to you, exactly what's wrong with it, but they'll know that something's not right. Now this commonly happens with buildings and with things like chimneys. It's much easier for me to draw it. You're going to understand it straight away. Let me show you what I mean and the practical applications for when you're drawing buildings. Now in this video I'm going to be drawing with a ballpoint pen simply because it'll make it easier for you to see on camera. I will make some mistakes, but it won't matter because we're not looking at doing a beautiful drawing here. I'm just looking at teaching you some building perspective. So this next tip relates directly to the last one, and this is that so often I see people drawing the top of things that they can't actually see. Now determining where your eye line in the photograph is, as per the last tip, was going to help you to avoid doing this. So many times I walk around my art class and people are drawing a house, just a standard house that you might view from the road. And, they'll do something like this and they'll draw something like this. And, there's our chimney. But what's wrong with this? What's wrong with it is that they've drawn the top. Okay, so here's the top of the chimney. Let's make it dark so you can imagine that there's a space in there. Now, how would I see this chimney? I would need to be up in the air looking down at it. I would need to be a bird, or perhaps somebody standing on a rooftop above, or maybe even on a cliff. But you see my point. If you're standing on the ground looking at a house like this, you cannot see the top. The same goes for square buildings and also for things like circular towers, lighthouses, anything like that. If you are drawing a circular tower or a circular structure and you're doing this, a chimney perhaps, again remember that you would only see this if you were above. If you're below, if your eye line is lower, then what you will see is this. Yeah? In reality, that circle is still there, but it's hidden from view. And if this circular chimney were exactly level with your eye line, I mean exactly level with the line of your eyes, you would see this. But if you're below it, it's going to curve up like this. And if you're above it, you're going to be able to see the top of it. Exactly the same with square chimneys or square buildings, if you're below them, what you're going to see instead is this. We can't see into the chimney unless we are standing above it. Now, most buildings are just some form of cube with a roof on. Now, assuming you're not face onto that building, you're looking at that cube for an angle, there's always going to be one corner that's closest to you. And this corner is really important. It's going to show you how to draw your building so that you are either above the building, below the building, or somewhere in between. It's really, really clever. It'll make so much sense to you if you've ever wondered how to make a building look like it's, above you on a cliff, or perhaps you're looking down at buildings, or maybe you're just standing on a street and your eye line's kind of, a third of the way up the building. This is going to explain how it all works. Now, if you follow this nearest corner rule, you're going to find it much, much easier to draw your buildings accurately so that you have the correct viewpoint within your painting or within your drawing. So let's imagine that we're looking at some kind of house and we're standing on the street looking at the house, because a house is just a cube, right? And then we might have, we might have some kind of roof on it, but mostly we've just got a cube. Now, if we were standing directly in front of the house, we'd only see one wall. It would be straight in front of us, so we would see this. So we're straight in front of the house now, and here's the wall, and here's the roof. But once the house is at an angle to us, we can now see two walls. We'll never see three walls because we can't see around corners, but we can see either side of it, which means that this line in the middle here, so we've got three lines, we've got 1, 2, 3. This one in the middle is the closest corner to us. Now, this is really, really important. Now, do you see how this points up and this points down? So if this is an ordinary size house, our eye line is going to be about a quarter or a third of the way up because people aren't as tall as two-story houses. So let's put that in. Let's imagine it's about here. Now, I don't want to get too into the mathematics of perspective here, but eventually all of these horizontal lines will reach our eye line. If we imagine our eye line is here, we are looking down at this corner, so corner points down. We are looking up at this corner, so corner points up. So that's what a house is going to look like when we're standing on the ground, looking down at the base and up at the roof, as you would be if you stood on any street. But what if I've got something different going on? What if I'm way above the house standing on a cliff? Or what if the house is way above me and the house is on a cliff? Now, by adjusting this nearest corner and these angles here, you can make it look like you're above or below the house. Let me show you how it works. So remember that when we're looking up, the corner goes up, and when we're looking down, the corner goes down. So let's draw the house again. So we start with this nearest corner again. Now, I want to be looking down at this house, so that means that rather than looking up and looking down, I'm going to do both corners down. So remember, look down, corners down, look up, corners up. So I'm going to put both of these corners up this time. And I am simplifying here. There is more to perspective than this, but this is just going to help you a little bit with your drawing. And you're going to keep the vertical lines vertical. Again, that does change in some circumstances, but if you're doing an ordinary size house, you can get away with keeping the vertical lines vertical and just adjusting the horizontal lines. Now, if we filled this in, I'll draw it lightly, we'd have a cube, wouldn't we? And we can see the top of the cube, we're looking down at it. But of course, in reality, let's give this one a sort of even-sided roof. In reality, there'd be a roof, wouldn't there? It's a good job I'm not a roofer, the rain would get in, wouldn't it? So, going from nearest corner, taking these 2 points downwards, we've now made a house that we are looking down on from above. And we know that because if we took the roof off and we just filled in that cube, we can see the top of it. And as you begin to notice this nearest corner, you're going to find this happening again and again. It's going to stop you doing the angles on your walls wrong. Of course, the exact angles are going to vary depending on your drawing, but it's quite easy to judge those just by placing a ruler along them and having a look. But it will stop your brain from playing tricks on you and getting these angles completely wrong. So let's think now about a house that we're looking up at, completely up at. The house is on top of a cliff. So remember I said if we're looking up, the angles go up. So let's do the same again. Let's draw the nearest wall. And this time let's put both of these angles upwards. And again, let's put a roof on it. So by pointing the corners of that nearest house corner upwards, we've now made a house that we're looking up at. Now, if it were flying, if it were a flying house, like from the Wizard of Oz or something like that, we'd actually be able to see the base of it. Now, since houses don't generally fly, we would imagine that this house is perhaps on top of a cliff. Now again, I'm drawing with a biro. I've actually got my drawing board at a slope so that I can film more easily. So these are not perfect by any means, but can you see the difference? By pointing these corners down, you are looking down at the house. By pointing these corners up, you are looking up at the house. And if you're standing so that your eye line is somewhere between top and bottom of the house and you're looking down at the base of the house, up at the roof of the house, as you would be on an ordinary street, then the top corner goes up, the bottom corner goes down. So remember, if you're looking down at the house, corners down. If you're looking up at the house, corners up. And I guarantee that now I've taught you this, you'll start to see it everywhere. As always at this point, if you're getting some value from this video, if it's useful to you, please can you click the thumbs up button for me? YouTube rewards channels with audience interaction. So by liking, sharing, subscribing or leaving me a comment, you'll ensure that this video gets pushed out to more people and I can show more people how to draw buildings. Now, of course, you can pretty much figure out the angle of maybe the top of the building and the bottom of the building just by looking at it by eye. But what about all those things that come between the roofline and the floor of the building? What about windows and doors? How on earth do you work out the angles of those? You need to find the vanishing point. It's not going to be difficult because you're going to be able to do it from the line at the top and the line at the bottom. You don't need to work anything out mathematically. It's going to show you how to line up windows and doors with the correct angles, top and bottom, in your buildings. So I've drawn another house here. I want to put some windows in it and I'm not quite sure how to line them up. Do I line them up, perhaps I line them up. Do I put them level with the top of the roof there? Do I put them level with the base? Do I put them straight on the paper? It's hard to tell, isn't it? Now the truth is that these perspective lines would actually continue until they met my eye line. You don't have to work this out exactly. If it's just a small building, you can get away with quite a lot when it comes to perspective. However, just knowing that these two corners converge, and there are invisible guidelines all the way along in between this point, that will help you to put your windows in. For instance, if we take this line here, and this line's here, then, we've got some lines in between, haven't we? We can imagine it comes out like a fan. What this is going to do is going to give you the correct angles for your windows. So imagine I want to put some windows here. I can go again following the rule of having the uprights upright. I can start to put my windows in along these imaginary guidelines. As I said, you do not have to get this exactly right. We can do it the other side too. What about putting a door in? Again, it just gives you a rough idea of how your windows and doors would sit and the horizontal lines, how they would go. So remember, you don't line them up with the top, you don't line them up with the base, they're going to be somewhere in between. You don't have to draw the vanishing point, chances are it could be off your paper anyway. But if you just sort of get a straight edge, perhaps your pencil, and just kind of have a think about it, and you can see roughly how that line would change and what angle to place the top and base of your windows at. Next, I've got for you a really simple and a really clever trick. This is going to enable you to find the center point of a wall that's angled away from you. So for instance, if you're looking straight at a house and there's a door in the middle of the wall, it's halfway across. So what happens to that when the wall is turned away from you? For instance, you've got a building at an angle. You know that the door's in the centre, but of course it may not actually be drawn in the centre because of perspective and because of foreshortening. How on earth do you know where to place that door? There's actually a really simple trick that's going to tell you exactly where to put it. So I've drawn another little house here. Now let's go back to the idea of a house that we're looking straight at. So here's our house. It's got flat perspective because we're standing directly in front of it in the centre. No perspective to worry about. And this house has got a door dead centre, just like a little chocolate box cottage illustration. Plenty of those exist in real life here in the UK. Okay, so there's our door in the middle. That's easy. If we wanted to make sure we got it in the middle, we could just measure the halfway point. What happens when it's on an angle like this? How do we find the center point? Because we have foreshortening, we'll see more of the wall here and less of the wall here. So there's a simple trick for this. So I'm going to go back to a pencil for a second, and we're going to draw, and these are just guidelines, we're going to draw from corner to corner and make a cross. Now where the center of that cross meets, I can take a line up. This is at 90 degrees to my paper. We've now found the center point of that wall. Now you see this side is bigger and this side is smaller, as it should be, because things that go away from us get smaller. So I now have a center point to place my door. And in fact, I'm going to make the door a little bit wider on that side than this side to also allow for that foreshortening. I can rub out my guidelines, and I've accurately placed my door in the center of the wall. Of course it works, I'll just do this one freehand, but of course it works on any size wall at any angle. So again, if I need the center point of the wall, I just take a cross, a straight line up, and here's the center of the wall. So if you're trying to draw a wall with something in the middle and you need to find that center point, but the wall is at an angle, it's facing away from you, this is how you find the center point. Now, although you may not have realised it, so far in this video we've mostly been looking at 2-point perspective. Don't worry if you don't know what that means. Now we're going to look at 3-point perspective. It's not as complex as it sounds, but it is going to affect very tall buildings. So it's not something you need to worry about if you're just drawing a house that you're standing on the street next to. But if you're drawing very, very tall buildings, 3-point perspective is going to affect the way they look. Again, there's no math involved in this. It's a really simple rule. Let me show you how it works. So remember, we were drawing these buildings from above and below, and I said there is a slight caveat actually to the fact that the walls remain upright. Now, if you're drawing a building and it's a 1 or 2 story building and it's on the ground, your viewpoint is just in the middle of it somewhere, you absolutely can get away with keeping these lines vertical. But we're going to talk now about 3-point perspective. You don't really have to understand it, but all it means is that things are going to get narrower if they're very, very tall, or if they're sloping away very steeply below you. So going back to our little house here, it's a long way above us. So the best way of drawing it would actually be to slope these sides out very slightly like this, so that they slope inwards as they go up. And you'll see this much more distinctly with tall buildings like churches. So where you can get away with this for a house, if you're doing something like a church, you're going to have to slope those walls in as you build your church. Always take the angles in your photograph as your guidance. But look at that. Can you see how already we look like we're getting a building? It looks more like a lighthouse actually, doesn't it? We're getting a building that's actually much, much taller. The same effect happens in reverse. If you are, for instance, standing at the top of a tower block looking down, you would see the opposite happen. They would converge as they went towards the ground. However, you rarely come across that circumstance. So all I want you to think about is that if something is a long way above you, or if it's very, very tall, it's a good idea to slope your sides in very slightly, just like we did with this little circular tower here. It's going to help to make things look like they have some height. So my next tip is not to use a ruler. Now straight away you're going to think I'm being hypocritical, because of course you will have seen me using a set square, a ruler in this tutorial, maybe a large T-square. However, what you won't see me do is draw along it to make my building shapes, and there's a very good reason for that. Now when people look at a drawing, a sketch or a painting, however realistic or however loose it is, they expect there to be some errors there, and they want to see the artist's impression. They're not looking for an exact copy of a photograph. So unless you're a draftsman or an architect, you really shouldn't be using a ruler, because actually you're making a rod for your own back. What happens if you put a perfect line in a piece of art is that the viewer will then expect all the other lines to be perfect. So if some of your lines are slightly out, you'll always get away with it, unless you've gone in with a ruler in some places, in which case those lines that aren't correct are going to be really, really noticeable. And worse still, if you go in with a ruler but you draw your straight line in the wrong place, it's only going to draw attention to it. So I want you to use your rulers and your set squares in a way that's clever, that's going to help you to work things out, but you don't want to be drawing along them. So what do you do if you want a straight line and you know damn well that you're not going to be able to draw it by hand? So I've got a really simple tip for you. We are going to use the ruler, but we're going to end up with a hand-drawn line. So what do you do if you want to use a ruler? Perhaps you've got a really flat horizon line. You want to get it square. This is a really big problem for some people. I see so many sloping seas you wouldn't believe. And physics suggests that sloping sea is not possible. It has to sit flat in the landscape. I'm not talking about waves here. I'm just talking about distant horizons. There are many occasions, and also sometimes for buildings, where you just know, especially if you're one of these people that tends to, I call it being cat-handed actually, you know, some of my students will sit and draw with their board kind of twisted round and kind of hunched over, and everything ends up, all their straight lines end up being a bit of an angle. Or perhaps you just aren't very good at drawing a straight line. Perhaps you have some problems with Parkinson's and multiple sclerosis or arthritis, or some reason why you have a difficulty manipulating your pencil or your pen or your paintbrush, and you just find it so hard to get a straight line. Now, drawing along a ruler for all the reasons we've discussed isn't the answer, but here's a trick that you can do. So what you do is you take your ruler and you're going to make some dots. Again, I'm doing this in pen, but normally I would do this in pencil. I'm just going to make some dots like this. So what you've got now is you've got a guideline. So all we're going to do is we're going to draw along the dots and join them up. And you can see I can be fairly scruffy with it. It's not perfect by any means, but what I'm not going to end up with is a line that ends up going down at a huge slope or that's completely off the rails. So if drawing straight lines is something that you have a problem with, either because of a physical difficulty or an illness, or just because you're not very good at it, or like all of us, you're just getting on a bit. God knows my hands aren't as steady as they were when I was younger. This is a really cool trick to give you what looks like a hand-drawn line, but with the aid of a ruler. Now the next one I spoke about in my landscape perspective video, and this is about getting things to lay flat, and it's a really, really simple rule. If your perspective isn't quite right and something appears to be tipping up towards you when it should be laying flatter, there are two things you need to do, or at least two potential things you need to do. You may need to do both of them, or perhaps just one of them, or perhaps the other one. What you need to do is lessen angles and reduce depth, and this will enable things to lay flatter. And again, this is our brain playing tricks on us. If we know something's a perfect square or a perfect circle, we'll want to draw it that way. Whereas really, in reality, often we're looking across things, and so things are foreshortened. They become squashed, they become wider, and the depth is lessened. The angles become decreased. Again, you don't have to work anything out. Just have a look at your picture. If something is tipping up when it shouldn't be, lessen the angle and reduce the depth. Let me show you some examples. So I've drawn a nice horizon line here. So let's draw a river, shall we? Let's draw a river going off to the horizon, or a path. It could be either. Well, it's kind of tipping up a lot, isn't it? It doesn't look very flat. So what you want to do is you want to reduce the angle. We could even curve it round, couldn't we? Do you see how there's quite a width to this bend here? Now this goes for pathways, for streets, anything at all. Let's look at our little house here. Okay, so let's say we have a path and we've got paving slabs either side. So let's do them in two different ways. Now on this side, I'm going to draw them as pretty much perfect squares. They're not laying very flat, are they? So what about here? If I start drawing them with a bit less depth and a bit more width, can you see how these start to lay flatter and these stand up? So whenever you're looking at anything, whether it's a circle, perhaps you have a circular stepping stone, like in some of those rustic gardens. If you draw it like this, your brain is going to assume one of two things. Either that you're above it looking down, or more likely, because physics would suggest this, that it's tipped up towards you. So therefore, if something that you draw looks like it's tipping up towards you, you need to reduce the angles and lessen the depth. So whenever you reduce the angles and you lessen the depth, things will start to lay flatter. It works for paving slabs, it works for pathways, anything at all. Let's again draw our tower with the circular top. I'm going to make it a bit too round this time. Well, look at that, it's tipping up towards us, isn't it? So all I've got to do is reduce the depth. Do you see how this is tipping up towards us? This is laying flat. This works for absolutely everything, including things like still lifes. If you're drawing something like a cube or a square box on a table, even the top of a vase, the top of a jug, the base of a lamp, whatever it is, if it's tipping up towards you, you need to either reduce the depth or lessen the angle, and straight away things will start to lay flat. Now you already know, I'm sure, that things get smaller as they get into the distance. Not in reality, of course, but our eyes make things look like they're getting smaller into the distance. But you may not fully understand how this works. So not only do things get smaller as they go into the distance, in that they reduce in height and width, that's important. They also get fainter. This is aerial perspective. I'll explain more about that in a moment. And more importantly, they get closer together. This also goes for things like windows in houses. So I'm going to point the camera downwards now and show you how an understanding of the way this works is going to make your buildings look much more realistic. So let me take you back to these windows that I drew in this house here. Now, you probably didn't take too much notice because I was teaching you about the angles of the top and the base, and we were too busy worrying about that. But you may have noticed that I actually did them smaller as they went further away from us. Did you also notice that I lessened the gaps between them as they went away from us? So it's important when you're putting repeating motifs into your painting, and by that I mean literally anything that repeats. The most common used one, of course, is fence posts, but it could be windows, it could be trees that are the same height. Anything that reduces as it goes into the distance gets smaller in both directions, so it gets less tall and it gets narrower. Not only this, the objects actually get closer together and they become fainter. So let's think about some fence posts going into the distance. Let's make an imaginary sort of pathway to our house. So here I've got a fence post. So the next one is not only going to be shorter and thinner, it's going to be a bit less distinct. And each one that I go along with, I think actually by the time we get up there they'd be far too small, wouldn't they? I told you I'd make some mistakes. Each one that goes along will be thinner, shorter, closer together. So completely wrong perspective to match that house, but you can see what I mean. So anything that repeats not only changes in size, it also gets closer together and it will become less distinct, which means that as you draw things that go into the distance, you want to be softer with them as they go into the distance. Remember that it's only things close up that you see really clearly in really strong colours. Now, this isn't the video for it. I'll probably do another video, but there's such a thing as aerial perspective. Now, the word perspective kind of suggests it's something to do with maths, but in fact it has nothing to do with maths. It's about the fact that things that go away from us get softer, bluer, fainter into the distance. So colours get cooler, things become less distinct and less hard-edged. So this is something that you can combine with this idea of your repeating motifs getting smaller and closer together as they go away from you. If you also do them fainter and bluer, in other words more cool, less warm, then you begin to mimic the way the lenses in our eyes see the real world, and you'll have a great chance of making things look like they have a realistic perspective in your paintings. So do let me know in the comments which of these tips you found the most useful. Now, in order for videos to be successful on YouTube, they have to be kept short and snappy. If you would like to watch me working step by step on my own paintings, really slowly, every single detail, every colour choice, every part of the drawing, every part of the painting, every technique, everything I use, do consider supporting me on Patreon. Videos are available from Tier 2 and Tier 3. If you click the link in the description, you can find out more about what's included. Now, if you found this video useful, I think you're going to absolutely love the video I did on drawing faces. It's been really popular. I'm going to show you simple tips for drawing faces accurately using curved guidelines and several other clever tips too. You can watch that video right now.